Today I'm talking about meltdowns and shutdowns and how I experience them as a late diagnosed autistic person. It's taken me a little while to get to this subject because, for whatever reason, it's been one of the more tricky areas for me to try and process since my diagnosis in February this year. And although I could really relate to autistic shutdowns because I've experienced many shutdowns in my life, I was a bit more confused about meltdowns, however, because I was pretty sure that I didn't experience them. But now that I've educated myself a little more on meltdowns, it's, yeah, pretty apparent that I did experience and do experience meltdowns. But firstly, I'm going to talk about autistic shutdowns. So firstly, what is an autistic shutdown? Well, for me personally, it involves removing myself entirely from what I perceive to be a stressful situation. And I've often spent a lot of time in bed in my life because it's the number one way where I can kind of relax, feel disconnected from my surroundings, and just focus on either what's in my head or really try to focus on nothing at all. For me, it's primarily an anxiety response, so it just really involves shutting down in many ways. So I just have to remove myself from all forms of stimuli, and everything just feels really overwhelming. It's often about trying to focus on the least amount of stuff. So I may well turn the lights off or shut the door and completely cocoon myself in bed for however long it takes me to feel like I, can recover from how I'm feeling. But also, I don't actually need to hide myself away or physically remove myself from a situation to have a shutdown, because I've spoken about this before, but in various jobs that I've had that have been kind of 9 to 5 really, on Sunday afternoons and Sunday evenings for sure, I'd get the kind of Sunday scaries. And I think many people get the Sunday scaries, don't they? It's all about thinking, oh, I've got work tomorrow, really don't want to go, I wish I had another day off, or I wish I had the week off. And they start to feel a bit kind of uncomfortable about the day or the week ahead. But for me, it felt really amplified, and I just would go into what I can only describe as a panic state, and it would get me into such a state that I just physically couldn't do anything. And my partner made the observation that on Sundays I would be there in physical form, but my whole internal way of being would be completely closed off. And Ian would ask me questions and he would struggle to get an answer out of me. But from my perspective, I just was so involved in worrying about the days or the week ahead. I just almost couldn't hear him. I just completely shut down, and I guess a bit of selective mutism was involved with this as well, because it was all I could do to worry about the days ahead. And yeah, it was just pure panic. And because at this time I wasn't aware that I was autistic, it was really difficult to explain to Ian how I felt, because he'd of course take this personally within the moments. But I tried my best to explain that, this is how I'm feeling because I'm really worried about going to work, really. And he did a really great job of trying to understand, but I'm just so grateful now to have my diagnosis and the language to describe how I'm feeling and how it all makes sense within the kind of paradigm of being autistic, really. And shutdowns for me can last anywhere from a few hours to days, really, because I remember in much of my working life, whenever I'd get really kind of stressed about work, I'd go home on a Friday and I'd just spend the weekend in bed. And it was all that I could do to do the bare minimum, really. I would find even TV to be really challenging because I just wasn't able to focus on what I was watching, or even, trying to remember what I was watching. It was really challenging. I do get way fewer shutdowns these days, but it's really because I'm home based, and I can't go out and get a job because I've got chronic illnesses. So yeah, I have to stay at home, which is frustrating, but it does mean that I do get fewer shutdowns these days as a result. So for me, while I was learning about autistic behaviours, that shutdowns was a really easy thing for me to understand, because this is something that I feel like I've had a lot of experience in my life about, so it made a lot of sense for me. But meltdowns was, yeah, something a little different. So what are autistic meltdowns? Well, if we consider that autistic shutdowns are all about our internal response to a situation that may well present itself to us, we keep everything inwards and within ourselves. Autistic meltdowns are the reverse in many ways, because it's outwardly showing our distress within a moment, and that can look like many things, really. So one of the first ways that I learned about autistic meltdowns was reading Fern Brady's book, and it's a phenomenal book, and I'd highly recommend you check it out. And I relate to a lot of her story, actually, and particularly as a young adult. But she spoke about meltdowns in a way that I just couldn't relate to, really. Her meltdowns were very physical, so she'd find herself kind of attacking furniture, etc. And it was just a way that she could kind of get all of this negative energy out, and she struggled with it. She, again, didn't know why on earth she was having to do this as a kind of stress response. And obviously, once she learned that she was autistic, this kind of started making a lot more sense for her. But yeah, I just couldn't relate to these stories at all. And, it just evidences how we're all different as autistic people. All of our experiences are entirely different from one another's in many ways, really. So because I was reading about this more kind of physical response to stress, I just assumed that I didn't get meltdowns, but I've been giving it a lot of thought, and I definitely do. They are thankfully very infrequent for me, but yeah, I can talk you through a couple of examples. My first example is quite similar to Fern's experience, actually, because it did provoke a more physical reaction in me. But some years back, Ian and I went to Cornwall on a holiday with our dog Jean Paul, and we'd stopped off somewhere as we realised we were really early for check-in. So I think it was Penzance we stopped off in. And essentially, we went for a walk, and the day was way hotter than we had anticipated. And when you've got a French bulldog or another dog that has difficulties with breathing, you'll know that that can be a massive issue, because they overheat really easily, and it's to do with the structure of their nose, really. They've got a shorter breathing tract, so they take in less air and obviously breathe out less air. So overheating is a real issue. And to be honest, I could go on about breeding standards in dogs and what I think about them for ages, but I'll save that for another day. But anyway, we ended up in a situation where we desperately needed to give him water, and although we were in the kind of town area, I just could not find a shop that sold water. So the longer this went on, the more kind of distressed Jean Paul was looking. So I said to Ian, look, you guys stay there, I'll run off, try and find a shop, and I'll get back to you. So after what seemed like ages, I eventually found a chemist. I got back to them with the water, threw it over Jean Paul, and gave him loads of water to drink. And I was frantic by this stage, I have to say. I thought there was a chance we might lose him. It was so horrible a situation to be in, and we were really caught short. This situation happens really infrequently with Jean Paul, because we're prepared 99% of the time, but this was the one day that we just didn't have water with us. So anyway, once we'd all calmed down and John Paul was doing much better, I said, you know what, I'm done with Penzance. I just would rather get in the car and head off on our way. And as we headed towards the car, Ian said, I'm just going to pop to the loo. So I stood outside with John Paul, and bearing in mind I was still really frantic at this stage, I just couldn't believe that this had happened. We could have lost our dog there and then. And as Ian came out, I said, right, I'm going to go to the loo as well, and then we'll get into the car. And it's one of these loos where you have to put in like 20p or something. So I put 20p in the slots, and I tried to open the door and it would not open. And I just went ballistic. I just absolutely had reached the end of my tether, and I started banging on this door and kicking it and screaming at it because I just couldn't cope. It was too much for me to deal with in that moment. I felt like I just did not know what to do with myself. So after this had gone on a little while, I said to Ian, I'm done. I don't want the loo. I can't be bothered with this. Let's just go back to the car. And he said to me, Lizzie, you've been trying to get into the wrong toilet. That's not the right door. And I think there's somebody in that loo. And I thought, you know what, I can't cope with this situation. It's too much for me. Just please remove me from all of this. Editing Lizzie here. Ian was trying to get my attention through all of this, but because he'd never seen me get into such a state before, he was really confused as to how to deal with the situation himself. And looking back, I feel so sorry for whoever was in that loo, because can you imagine having somebody kicking and screaming at the door outside? And I feel really bad, and I really wish I could apologise to that person, but in the moment I had no embarrassment. Just wanted to get the hell away from all of this. It was too much. And for me, looking back, that really looks like an autistic meltdown. There was just too much stimuli and negative stimuli at that for me to cope. It was just too overwhelming, and I just needed to get the hell away from that situation. And the second example I can give you is work related. And it's so interesting looking back now, because there's so much negative stuff that's happened in my life that is work related. It's just caused me so much stress. But anyway, I was working within a role that had loads going on within the job description and beyond the job description. And I was working on an event, I think it might have been a conference. So there's just loads of stuff going on behind the scenes, and you have to try and give your focus to so many things in any moment going on. It's really stressful environments, and I was already trying to really focus on a specific task when my boss came in and just gave me a whole new list of things to do. And I was so frazzled in that moment. I couldn't believe that this was being added to my to-do list, and it needed doing urgently, as did the other thing that I was working on. And I got to a state that I didn't even know was possible to get to, and it was complete hysteria. It's when you're half laughing and half crying. And I always thought this was kind of an abstract thing, this kind of hysteria, but I was just so stressed out. And because there was so much stress going on, it felt absurd for my boss to hand me even more stuff. It felt like almost like something out of a sitcom. I was kind of almost observing myself from the third person. I thought, this cannot be real. This situation is just madness. And I couldn't get out of this state of being for a good few minutes. I just felt like I was going mad, and that's the only way I can kind of describe how it felt. It was so stressful, and again, it was just complete panic. I'd just been kind of lumbered with all of this stuff, and I had like no understanding as to how I was kind of going to deal with it. And it just felt like some weird, horrific comedy. is the best way that I can describe it, really. But that's the biggest kind of meltdown at work that I can remember. But there's been various times when I've just started crying at work because I've just had too much to do. I just found it impossible to carry on as normal. I just get to a point where I feel so overwhelmed. And I realise now, with my new understanding of autism, that a monotropic brain does not lend itself well to multitasking, which is required in so many jobs. I do so much better when I'm just focusing on one thing at a time. I just really struggle with multitasking, and it's taken me 50 years to realise this. So, who knew I have experienced meltdowns in my life, but I had no idea what they were or why they were happening to me. I do experience other kinds of meltdowns too, and the phone is actually a bit of a clue here, but I'll save this discussion for a video on alexithymia. And alexithymia is basically having difficulties with recognising emotions. So while we're talking about meltdowns and shutdowns, I thought I'd have a little bit of a chat on terminology because it's an area that I find really interesting. I think the word meltdown in particular has so much kind of negative connotation going on with it because it's been a word that's overused in today's society. You know, such and such is having a meltdown at work, and it's very often used to describe somebody that's just a bit stressed, isn't it? But of course, we know that meltdowns are way beyond feeling a bit stressed. I think also the word meltdown is often used as a synonym for the word tantrum, but they actually mean different things. Tantrum, for me, is a word that is used to describe somebody who is heavily invested in a situation, in that they want something. We often think about children when we hear the word tantrum, and they are trying to get something that they want out of a situation, or a situation that's making them feel frustrated, and they're doing whatever they can to draw everybody's attention to this scenario that's going on. They want help in many ways to achieve their goal. The word meltdown for me means that somebody is invested in getting themselves out of a situation that feels uncomfortable to them, and it may even feel dangerous for them, so they will do whatever they can to remove themselves from that situation, and it is not about drawing attention to themselves whatsoever. If anything, it's the complete opposite. And I was interested to see actually a similar point on terminology by Autistic over on one of Autistic Jenny's Creator Collab videos. And I think it's certainly worth a watch, so I'll link that below if you want to go and check that one out afterwards. But essentially, I think our terminology doesn't help us at times. And I feel quite similarly about the term on the spectrum as well. I think it's so difficult, isn't it, trying to get people or neurotypical people to understand what being on the spectrum is, because the word on suggests something kind of linear, doesn't it? Like a line. And it can be really difficult to explain that it's much more nuanced than that we're not just easily described in this way. And for me, something like within the autism spectrum might make it a bit easier to explain, or for people to understand that it's not just a place between two given points, it's something bigger and wider, and there's just more scope within it, really. I think in terms of semiotics, it just makes it kind of easier for some people to visualise, really. I've come to use Photoshop on my computer, so I apologise if there's any weird audio going on, but I wanted to explain why I think within the spectrum kind of works better. And what better example could there be than a colour spectrum? And you can see here that there's absolutely masses of different colours going on within the Photoshop colour spectrum here. And I'm going to choose a really nice kind of teal tone, I think, because that's my favourite colour. And you can see that for every colour that you choose within the palettes or within the spectrum, each and every colour gives a different profile in terms of the RGB quantities. So that's red, green and blue essentially. So if I move that around, the colours change. And similarly for the CMYK, which might make more sense if you've got a colour printer, so that's your cyan, magenta, yellow and black quantities. So I think it kind of almost shows how a spiky profile can change within the autism spectrum. And while it's certainly not perfect, for me it kind of works a little better as a visual descriptor really. And I appreciate we've not all got Photoshop in our pocket to show people what we mean, but even without a Photoshop colour picker, a basic colour wheel makes more sense as a visual aid than a flat line, as each and every colour within the spectrum has its own unique profile. But you know, that's just my opinion. I think it can take years, if not decades, for language to change and evolve and be more descriptive really of what we're trying to convey. But I just think at the moment some of our language probably doesn't help us. But anyway, I would love to hear if you can relate to any of the examples I've given today, or if you can't relate at all and yeah, your experiences are completely different. Perhaps you don't experience shutdowns or meltdowns. I'd love to know. And I think it just highlights how different we all are, doesn't it? So thank you for watching. Give it a like if you got this far, and I'll see you again soon.